Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be looking at the loads that occur on guardrails and handrails. All the loads in this presentation are applied only to the top rail, but the loads on handrails are the same. So anywhere you see me talking about a load, it applies the same on the handrail. So we're going to get straight to the point today with the easy way. Now, the easy way to do this is you make sure that each of your guardrails is at least 4 foot on center. And when you're doing your analysis, you apply the 200-pound point load at the top of that guardrail. Now, the guardrail is 42 inches tall per code. Now, obviously, it can be a little taller. And that ends up giving you the moment at the base of the guardrail post of 8.4 kip inches for allowable strength design and 13.4 kip inches at LRFD. The difference there, of course, being the live load factor of 1.6. Now, this presentation focuses on the moment that occurs at the bottom of the guardrail post, because that ends up being the most importantest of important things. Now, you need to also check the guardrail post for the same load. The top rail needs to be able to resist these loads. The handrails need to be able to resist these loads. The brackets that connect the handrails to the guardrail post also need to be able to resist these loads. But this presentation is going to focus on that moment at the bottom of the guardrail post, because that's where I see the most problems usually show up. So that was the easy way. But of course, as with all things, there are hard ways. We are going to look at a series of different situations in this presentation. And the first of those situations is going to be the easy way, because that's how I like to go. The second situation it's different. These guardrail posts we're assuming are 1 foot on center. This third example is going to look at the case where the guardrail posts are longer, the spaces are larger. Hey, I have water. The spaces are longer than 4 foot on center. I'm going to have to figure out whether or not taking a drink on camera is a good idea or not. We're working through the baby steps here. And the final system that I'm going to look at are, you often see these handrails that are projected out beyond the guardrail post. And so I'm going to look at that briefly. One thing I need to address just really quickly, because there's no slide about it, is the load on the infill rails. That ends up being a 50-pound load applied over 1 square foot. So I usually will figure out how many rails, how many infill elements are going to receive that load. So if it was 8 of them, I don't do math in public, 50 pounds divided by 8, then each element would receive a 6.25 pound load. Technically, that load, that 6.25 pounds, is spread over a foot. But if you apply that load as a point load to the infill, you're going to get a conservative result for the strength of that infill. The final thing we're going to look at in this presentation are, I'm not going to do too much analysis on this one, but this is just the idea of these guardrails are a system. And so when you end up with point loads and indeed line loads, depending on your assumptions, those systems are going to have different results. That's the one at the end where I blather a bit. I'm not saying I won't blather other times. I'm going to blather other times, trust me. So in this presentation, we're not going to look at the exceptions. The exceptions are 1 and 2 family dwellings and other kind of fringe cases, roofs, factories, industrial settings. If you design your guardrails and your handrails for the loads we discussed today and then use them on a roof or in a factory, your design is going to be a little bit conservative, but nobody got sued because they were a little conservative. Keep in mind that there's one thing I quibble a bit with. This is the code, and so always definitely do what the code says. I don't think I would have necessarily written this way, but in the California Building Code here on the right-hand side, it says to use the 50-pound per linear foot in accordance with section 4.5.1.1 in ASD. So if you go to the ASD section 4.5.1.1, it instructs you to apply that load in any direction along the handrail or top rail. So that means that not only do the 200 pounds and 50 pounds per linear foot get pushed out to save you from toppling over the edge, but also code requires that those loads occur inward as well. So that's the way it was written. So now we look at the easy case where these guardrail posts here are put at 4 foot on center. And so your 50 pound per linear foot or 200 pounds non-concurrent give you the same net result at the top of every guardrail post. Again, you do need to also verify that the top rails and the infill also meet code strength requirements. There are, maybe somewhat surprisingly, no deflection requirements in the code for handrails. I've seen some kind of weird situations where I calculated that handrails would get like 6 inches of deflection in weird design examples. And so, as a reasonable designer, you might want to stiffen up that system, but there's no code requirements for that. Now, this picture is a good place to get started on this idea of tributary length, because there are 4 feet of top rail tributary to the guardrail post. And so at 50 pounds per linear foot, that 4 feet ends up with the 200 pounds. Now, if you had a guardrail post at 1 foot on center next to a space that was 6 foot on center, you'd get half a foot between the next 1 foot, and you'd get 3 feet between the next 3 feet. So technically, you'd still be meeting that 4 foot of tributary top rail, if that makes any sense. And if it doesn't make any sense, then just put your posts at 4 foot on center maximum and you'll never have a problem. Now, these loads are in allowable strength design, which is going to be for the rest of this presentation. If you're doing some, obviously if you're doing anchorage analysis with like hilting anchors or some such, you're definitely going to have to use LRFD, but I will often use allowable stress design because it's easier. And if all of that is Greek to you, I am eventually certainly going to make a video about the differences between ASD and LRFD, but I haven't done that yet, so you'll just have to wait. Or go to YouTube and type in ASD versus LRFD, and I'm sure other people have addressed it adequately. So this is the example where we have posts at 1 foot on center, and we know that there's this top rail here. And if you receive a 200-pound point load anywhere along that top rail, it's going to spread that load to many adjacent posts. So the moment at the bottom of these posts is actually governed by the 50 pound per linear foot. So if you have 1 foot on center for these posts, you're only assuming a 50 pound point load at the top of each post. And so your allowable strength design moment is 2.1 kip inches. That's not my project right there. So I don't know if those little anchors, they look kind of small. Anyway, so this is the example where we assume that the guardrail posts are spaced farther than 4 foot on center. Now you can see on the left-hand side, they did go 4 foot 5 inches. On the right-hand side, they actually went 2 foot 9 inches. So if you actually add up half of the tributary length on the left and half of the tributary length on the right, it ends up being less than 4 feet. So they did it the easy way here. But we are going to pretend that this middle one doesn't exist for this example. And so our tributary length of that top rail producing the maximum moment at the bottom of that post, tributary length is almost 5 foot. And so the maximum moment is 10.4 kip inches. So this is projected handrails. That 200-pound point load or 50 pounds per linear foot obviously applies in any direction along these handrails. And so if we wanted to look at this anchor at the bottom of this last post, this is another project that I didn't actually do. And so this is not to scale. This thing looks to me like more than 2 feet. But if we assumed that it was 2 feet and you had 2 foot on the right-hand side, then you still have the 4 foot of tributary length for that guardrail post, and nothing really changes too much. For this last one, this is a case you're going to see a lot in stairways, where the guardrails do this switchback thing. And because of that, you end up with often, 10 or 12 feet between the floor below and the landing. Oftentimes, especially in a case like this where you've got these pretty chunky infill rails, you could pin the bottom of this post here and the bottom of this post here, and you could end up resisting that 50 pound per linear foot load across the top of this rail if you were to run all this in a structural analysis program, which you shouldn't do because you're not being paid to do that. But if you did do it, it would almost certainly work. And so the idea that, the question to me then becomes, well, what are you assuming for the loads on the flight above and the flight below? Because if you assume there are no loads on those guardrails, you can just use all these posts at the floor level and the landing level to resist the loads that were on any particular flight. But if you were to assume that all 50 pounds per linear foot were occurring to the right for this rail, and that those 50 pounds per linear foot were occurring to the right for this rail, and those 50 pounds per linear foot were occurring to the right for this rail, which is the most conservative interpretation of the code, and it is indeed the way the code is written. At the end of the day, your best bet is to go with the easy way. Put each post maximum 4 foot on center, and when you're doing analysis, apply a 200-pound point load at the top, and you'll always turn out okay. So if you've watched the whole video, thank you for your time, and we'll see you on the next one.